When you envision the history of the United States, what comes to mind first? For many, it's not a string of dates or a parade of powered wigs, or even an endless line of campaign speeches. No, it's pictures. Big, bold, sometimes confusing pictures. It's the stuff you find on postage stamps, in textbooks, and on the walls of the world's most prestigious museums. Americans, after all, have always loved a good spectacle. American art reflects and refracts the nation's evolving cultural and political landscapes. We don't need to like all of it, but we should know where it came from and what it's trying to say. If you ever want to dive into the ideas and art history rabbit holes that don't quite fit the shape of a YouTube video, I write about all of that over on my Substack. It's the companion piece to this channel, and it's completely free. So if that sounds like something you'd like, click the link in the video description and subscribe so the new pieces find their way to you. The United States' rich artistic history stretches from the earliest indigenous cultures to the more recent globalization of contemporary art. But before there was a United States, there were nations, hundreds of them. Centuries before the first European colonizers landed, indigenous communities across the continent developed complex visual languages, manifested in sculptural forms, painted surfaces, woven textiles, and ceremonial artifacts. These creations articulated collective memory, the natural environments, and their spiritual belief. In the West in California, we saw effigy figurines and elaborate basketry that is amongst the most intricate in the world. We also saw rock art like the Chumash cave paintings that demonstrate a complex symbolic vocabulary and a deep engagement with the landscape. In the Great Plains region, artists are known for their buffalo hide paintings, beadwork, and quill work. These mediums had decorative purposes, yes, but also functioned as vehicles for historical narration, most notably in the creation of winter counts, which are pictorial calendars that meticulously recorded tribal events and histories. Following the decline of buffalo populations in the late 19th century, the artists of this region adapted to new materials, producing ledger art, which are narrative drawings or paintings executed on paper or cloth, primarily depicting battles and the rapidly shifting social and technological environment, including the introduction of firearms. In the Northwest, indigenous communities such as the Tlingit are known for their monumental wood carving and ceremonial regalia, often painted with representations of animals and supernatural beings. In the Southwest, the Pueblo, Navajo, and Hopi artists are skilled in the art of pottery, weaving, and sand painting. In fact, the Pueblo peoples have been making pottery using methods that have remained largely unchanged since the classic Pueblo period, circa AD 1050. Now, it's interesting to note that the oldest known painted object in North America from 10,000 years ago is the Cooper bison skull. Found in Oklahoma, it bears a red lightning bolt using hematite-based mineral paint, and is the very first record of the deep antiquity of indigenous artistic expression on the continent. Beginning in the late 15th century, European colonizers started arriving in the Americas. Christopher Columbus is the most famous of these early settlers, though he was not the first European to reach the continent. Norse and Scandinavian explorers had landed in what is now Canada centuries earlier. Columbus's arrival is what marked the start of large-scale and sustained European colonization. He instituted practices such as slavery and mass killings that contributed significantly to the depopulation of indigenous communities. And these practices were carried on by the colonizers that came after him for decades. A friar's record of the time even states the severe violence and exploitation inflicted on indigenous peoples. He says, they forced their way into settlements, slaughtering everyone they found there, including small children, old men, pregnant women, and even women who had just given birth. The numbers further ground the reality of these atrocities. When Europeans arrived in Hispaniola in 1492, The estimated indigenous population of the Americas was about 60 million. By the early 17th century, approximately 90% were killed due to violence, enslavement, forced displacement, or disease. European colonizers also worked to destroy the works of indigenous peoples. They initiated a protracted process of cultural suppression and erasure, wherein indigenous artistic production was either assimilated, devalued, or outright destroyed by colonial systems of power and aesthetics. Yet indigenous artists adapted with resilience. New materials such as glass beads, metal tools, and trade cloth were incorporated into their traditional forms, creating hybrid aesthetics that were both acts of survival and statements of identity. The recognition of indigenous American art within mainstream art history has gained traction only in recent decades. Exhibitions such as MoMA's Indian Art of the United States in 1941 and the ongoing curatorial efforts at institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Denver Art Museum have begun to shift the discourse, but the work of full inclusion and restitution remains far from complete. During the early colonial years, most Western-trained artists were military officers whose training included landscape sketching, reflecting the practical needs of exploration and territorial mapping. As more and more people emigrated to the US, colonial artists, namely portrait artists, were given more support. John Smibert was one of these artists. He arrived from London in 1728 with the hopes of becoming an art professor in Bermuda, but instead became the portrait painter to the elite in Boston. He was a talented European-trained artist that helped to shape the early artistic culture of the American colonies. Folk art in the United States is considered a critical domain of visual culture. It's largely practiced in communities that have often been excluded from elite artistic institutions, whether by class, geography, race, or education. These pieces tell the story of America told not by the powerful, but by regular Americans. It is frequently functional in form, weather vanes, quilts, and furnitures, but expressive in function, having both an aesthetic and narrative purpose. Edward Hicks, who was a Quaker minister, translated religious ideals into a symbolic visual language through the Peaceable Kingdom series. These pieces were inspired by the biblical prophecy of Isaiah and symbolize harmony and redemption, reflecting Hicks' Quaker beliefs and contemporary social divisions. African American folk traditions are exemplified in the narrative quilts of Harriet Powers. Born into slavery, Powers' quilts are among the most important examples of 19th century Southern and African American folk art. They are recognized for their remarkable command over shape and color, and the narrative power each thread holds. Today, the legacy of folk art continues to resonate almost 300 years later, particularly through its influence on the concept of outsider art and its challenge to conventional aesthetic hierarchies. The signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 marked the official beginning of the American national identity, and this new nation needed a history and iconography to go along with it. Colonial painters continued to rely on European stylistic conventions, but a distinctive American narrative did start to take form, particularly through portrait and historical paintings. Portraiture was used as a tool for colonial planters, merchants, and political leaders to assert and display their social status, to celebrate their family, or hint at their aspirations. The elite had the only hand in play in creating the vision around what the Federal period art should be, and John Singleton Copley was their artist of choice. In his portrait of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Mifflin, for instance, the depiction of Sarah Mifflin spinning yarn is a deliberate reference to the political act of boycotting British goods, signaling the couple's commitment to the American cause. His portraits of Paul Revere or founding fathers like Samuel Adams and John Hancock helped to document America's transformation into an independent nation. Another portrait artist was Gilbert Stuart. His famous unfinished portrait of George Washington became the model for the image on the US $1 bill. the artist John Trumbull took to historical paintings, such as this one, Declaration of Independence. Here we see the presentation of the draft document to the Second Continental Congress. Trumbull's goal with this painting was not strict historical accuracy in the events, but rather he wanted to create an enduring image of the nation's founders and the ideals they represented. He included 47 figures, many painted from life, to symbolize the collective effort behind American independence. In the 1820s, the very first distinctly American artistic movement began. The Hudson River School, led by Thomas Cole, and including members such as Albert Bierstadt, Frederick Edwin Church, and Asher B. Durand, was based out of Upper New York State. These artists wanted to capture the sublime grandeur and unique beauty of the wilderness they saw around them, particularly that of the Hudson River Valley, Catskill, Adirondacks, and later the American West and South America. In part, they looked to the Romanticism movement of Europe and applied its ideals of reverence for nature and subjective imagination to their works. Their art often juxtaposed untouched wilderness with signs of human settlement to convey themes of discovery, exploration, and the coexistence of civilization and nature. Cole's landscapes of Cotterskill Fall and Catskill Mountains present the American wilderness as a place of profound beauty and spiritual significance. They resonate with contemporary philosophical movements like Transcendentalism, which emphasize the inherent goodness of nature and the individual's spiritual connection to it. The works of the Hudson River School influenced subsequent movements, including the more meditative Luminism. This movement emphasized the landscape itself with diminishing human presence and a distinct focus on the radiant effects of light and the atmosphere. Led by John Frederick Kensett, Luminism parted ways with the monumental dramatic scenes that came before them and instead focused on smaller and quieter canvases. Luminist artists were associated with a particular locale as they returned to the same scenes, painting the changing lights and atmosphere from day to day and season to season. They revealed no brushstrokes. They hid their hand in the painting and created silent, almost impersonal surfaces of effervescent beauty. We can see that here in Fitzhenry Lane's 1863 painting, Lumber Schooners at Evening on Penobscot Bay. The painting is not about the people or the ship, though they're there, rendered with all the care of a miniaturist. What grabs us is the sweep of nature, the seemingly infinite sky, and the water catching the light just so. The calm atmosphere is contagious, as if the painting is breathing out and we are breathing it in. The Luminists inspired a new generation of artists, the Tonalists, who took this a step further. They embraced a more poetic approach to landscape painting that prioritized mood, harmony, and subtle gradation of color over meticulous representation. These artists carefully chose their often neutral color palettes, softly brushed in the contours with visible strokes, used layer glazes to invoke the density of the unseen air, and painted dreamlike twilight and night scenes of introspective quiet. James McNeill Whistler, though American by birth, developed his mature tonalist style while living and working in England. His painting, Nocturne Blue and Silver Chelsea, depicts the River Thames at twilight. The colors are varying shades of blue that were applied in thin layers. Sometimes he painted while the paint was still wet, which gave the colors a soft, fluid look that blends together smoothly. The influence of Japanese woodblock prints is clear in this work, through both Whistler's limited color palette, similar to the restrained tones often found in Japanese prints, and the butterfly motif at the bottom, which he used as his signature. He once said, "A nocturne is an arrangement of line, form, and color first," articulating that a painting should be valued for its formal qualities rather than for its narrative or literal content. Artistic movements often overlap and don't always progress in a neat linear fashion. While landscape paintings really flourished in the 19th century, other artists were responding to the ever-evolving social and economic realities of American life. So let's now look at a parallel branch of American art history defined by its focus on human subjects, everyday life, and the nation's defining moments. In the 1850s, population growth and economic expansion led to a more active art market, which included auctions, art lotteries, and more urban galleries popping up. This expansion also led to artists wanting to distinguish their styles in a competitive market. This carved a small space for perspectives of women artists like Lily Martin Spencer, whose representations of domestic life offered a nuanced critique of gender roles. In Spencer's Young Husband and Young Wife, we see the reality of early married life. The young man carries an overflowing basket of groceries, struggling with his role and the judgmental gazes of amused onlookers. The young woman peels an onion as she looks at the mismatched purchases of her husband, while a confused maid stands by. In these companion pieces, we see the challenges and sometimes humor of domestic adjustment in 19th century America. This painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware, is one of the most recognizable images in the history of American art. It doesn't fit into a specific movement that was alive during the time, yet it still played a critical role in shaping American national identity and political discourse. It might be interesting to know that it was not crafted on American soil, nor by a native-born artist. Emanuel Leutze, a German-American immigrant, painted this piece in Dusseldorf, Germany. The scene he chose to immortalize in its monumental size took place more than 7 decades before he picked up his brush. George Washington leading his troop across the Delaware River on the night of December 25, 1776. This bold maneuver, aimed at launching a surprise attack on Hessian forces near Trenton, proved to be a pivotal and morale-boosting victory for the Continental Army. Crammed into the small boat are 13 figures, each individual's clothing hinting at their diverse backgrounds. One wears a tarpaulin jacket, likely representing a sailor from New England, his features suggesting African ancestry. Another is a Scottish immigrant in a Balmoral cap. In the forefront, there's an androgynous figure, perhaps a woman, in a loose red shirt, helping to row. Leutze's intention was to encourage European reformers during the 1848 revolutions taking place in Germany, urging them to see the American Revolution as a beacon of liberty and national unity. It's important to note that despite Leutze's fascination with history, the painting takes quite a few liberties with the facts. The flag depicted, for example, was not adopted until months after the event. As well, the boat is unrealistically small for the number of people it carries. The actual crossing happened in the dead of night, yet Leutze paints it at dawn. The river shown is wide and icy, more reminiscent of the Rhine than the Delaware. Most famously, Washington stands upright at the boat's prow, a dramatic but improbable stance in such a vessel. The American Civil War of the 1860s had a profound impact on art history, shifting from romanticized landscapes and nationalist portraits to realism and documentary accuracy that reflected the unprecedented violence and social upheaval of the time. Artists couldn't pretend anymore. They couldn't retreat into their imagination. Eastman Johnson's A Ride for Liberty, The Fugitive Slaves, is of an enslaved family fleeing towards the safety of Union lines in the dim early morning light. What sets this work apart from most art of the era is the complete absence of white figures. The African-American family is shown as the central force in their own liberation, acting decisively to secure their freedom. Johnson stated that the painting was inspired by an incident he personally witnessed near the Manassas, Virginia battlefield on March 2, 1862, just before the Union troops took control of the area. Another artist who faced the truth of the time and painted it was Winslow Homer. He, among others, began showing us not the idea of America, but its entrails. Originally a commercial printmaker, Homer transitioned into becoming a serious painter during this era, which marked a broader professionalization of American art. His paintings, The Veteran in a New Field and Prisoners from the Front, show us a deeper understanding of the impacts of war. His work addressed universal themes through specifically American subjects, with an honest eye and an emotional restraint. And this is when artists' imagination gave way to the truth they observed around them. In the aftermath of the Civil War, there came a collective ache for the innocence that seemed lost to the war. This nostalgia found visual expression in the proliferation of images of children who became symbols of hope and renewal. In Winslow Homer's Snap the Whip painting, we see the spirited energy of childhood captured. This group of barefooted boys are playing a lively game outside, closely connected to the natural world around them. The cooperation and unity that's required in their game is a symbol for the broader need for national healing. Yet Homer still acknowledges the difficulties ahead by showing the boy on the left losing his grip. The weathered red schoolhouse in the background is there to evoke fond memories of rural traditions, just as America was beginning to face the uncertainties of industrialization. By the mid-1870s, the United States had become a major industrial power, behind only Great Britain and France. Industrial growth, especially in the North, was driven by widespread use of coal-powered machinery and steam engines, leading to the rise of factories in urban centers. This created many new jobs and helped support the growth of the middle class, now with a little time and a little money to spare. So suddenly, thanks to the marvels of the modern printing press, affordable books and color prints flood the market at increased speeds and volumes. Culture, which was once a luxury, became an everyday pleasure for the many, not the few. As well, increased immigration, spurred by the Irish potato famine and German unrest, changed urban demographics and expanded the industrial workforce. Exposure to European culture grew through travel, art reproductions, and the founding of major museums, such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museums of Fine Art in Boston and Philadelphia. Interest in contemporary European art, particularly French, increased, and more American artists traveled to Europe to study new styles and techniques and embraced a new sense of internationalism. It was around this time that American Impressionism began to take shape. Major exhibitions in New York and Boston introduced French Impressionist works to the American public. Although audiences were drawn to the landscape pieces, they recoiled at the frank realism and nudity in figure paintings. While the movement's origin is undeniably indebted to the innovations of the French Impressionists, whose radical techniques and modern subject matter had already upended the European art world, American artists adapted these principles to reflect their own unique setting and sensibilities. American Impressionism favored more asymmetrical compositions, cropped figures, and steep perspectives. These artists applied pure color directly from the tube, used broken brushstrokes, and practiced impasto, a style of painting characterized by thick, raised strokes. Mary Cassatt and Childe Hassam are two of America's most well-known Impressionists. Cassatt represents a remarkable case of transatlantic artistic exchange. She moved to Paris in 1866 at the age of 22 to study art privately, as women were not yet able to attend most academic institutions. There, she became friends with Edgar Degas, who invited her to exhibit with the French Impressionists in 1877. In fact, she was the only American artist to have exhibited with the original Impressionists in France. She even leveraged her connections to America's upper class to purchase Impressionist pieces, helping to seed the great collections that would eventually fill American museums. Ever the quiet revolutionary, Cassatt painted women not as objects to be gazed upon, but as people with things to do. That is most clearly evident in her painting, The Child's Bath. The subjects, a woman, presumably a mother, and a young child, are positioned closely, nearly filling the entire canvas. Her posture is protective and careful, her left hand holding the child gently while the right one washes her foot. The composition draws us into a private, everyday moment that's made elevated through Cassatt's careful attention to perspective, pattern, and mood. While Cassatt's art advanced the representation of women and family, another American artist, Childe Hassam, worked to immerse viewers in the picturesque scenes of New York and the Northeast. My favorite work of his, one that I couldn't look away from, is Celia Thaxter's Garden, Isles of Shoals, Maine. It's part of a series he painted while staying on Appledore Island just off Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Before us is a profusion of flowers, scarlet poppies and wildflowers dancing in the breeze, cultivated by Hassam's friend Celia Thaxter, an American writer, poet, and clearly a great gardener. Behind them, sun-bleached rocks and the ocean stretch out, giving us both a sense of depth and a glimpse into Hassam's total view. The poppies, though, are the true stars, their colors a marvelous contrast to the harsh, rugged landscape of the island. The paint application is lively and spontaneous, capturing the fleeting effects of sunlight and the movement of a summer breeze over the flowers and surrounding foliage. It might seem like Hassam has painted a perfect view, but this piece is not an escapist fantasy. The garden was real and rooted in lived experience, painted by an artist who understood that reality, when seen with clarity and affection, is more than enough. In the early 1900s, American cities were tough places to live. Most people scraped by on modest incomes. Kids often worked instead of going to school, and urban neighborhoods were cramped and unsanitary. Artists took notice, and rather than painting the usual beautiful landscapes or portraits of the wealthy, a group called the Ashcan School set out to show what city life was really like. This school of American artists wanted to distinguish themselves from the American Impressionists that came before them, so they took to Realism. The school's first generation of artists were based in Philadelphia and were led by Robert Henry. They looked back at the works of masters such as Diego Velázquez, Francisco Goya, and Edward Manet, and used their classical methods to create realistic and gritty scenes of modern, working-class life, or what Henry called art for life's sake. After the group relocated to New York City, a second generation of artists followed, including George Bellows, whose drawing that was captioned "Disappointments of the Ashcan" gave the group its name. The artists, many of whom began their careers as newspaper illustrators, favored broad calligraphic forms, which they painted quickly and often from memory to evoke the immediacy of the urban experience. In Bellows' Cliff Dwellers, we see a crowd of people on the street of Lower East Side, New York on a hot summer day. We can feel the energy and congestion of life in these tenement buildings, with crowds of adults and children spilling onto stoops, sidewalks, and fire escapes. There's laundry strung overhead and a street vendor working his cart. Bellows uses gestural brushwork and darker color palettes to depict both the vitality and hardship of New York's working-class neighborhoods. In 1913, Morgan Russell and Stanton McDonald Wright launched Synchromism, America's first avant-garde and abstract art movement. They adopted the color theories of Ernest Percival Tudor, a Canadian living in Paris who believed that the 12 colors of the spectrum corresponded to the 12 steps of the musical scale. Russell coined the name of the movement by combining the words symphony and chrome. The swirling colors of a synchromian green, which is not publicly acquired and so there's no image of it available unfortunately, was said to have created a visual symphony or musical effect. It was exhibited at the 1913 Salon des Indépendants in Paris, and there it launched the movement. Although Synchromism was brief and initially an underappreciated movement, it contributed to the gradual acceptance of non-objective art in the United States, paving the way for later developments in American modernism and abstraction. Georgia O'Keeffe, said to be the mother of American modernism, continued in the abstraction ideals of synchronist artists. Her work distills organic forms into powerful, simplified shapes and vibrant colors. In her 7-decade career, she produced more than 2,000 artworks of flowers, barren landscapes, and close-up still lifes. These have now become an inseparable part of the mythology and iconography of the American artistic landscape. In her work, Cow's Skull, Red, White, and Blue, we see a stark white skull with its sharp edges and a worn surface. She often painted bones and skulls, a motif she developed during her visits to New Mexico in the late 1920s. To her, They represented the desert's enduring beauty. She once stated that bones were strangely more living than the animals walking around. The vertically striped background in red, white, and blue, a color combination that Americans know all too well, evoke a nationalist spirit that, like the skull, is undying. Through such works, O'Keeffe helped continue the establishment of abstraction as a legitimate artistic pursuit, fusing natural imagery with a distinctly modernist vision. In the 1920s in Harlem, New York, a profound intellectual and cultural revival was taking place, and this time, perhaps for the first time ever, it was a celebration of African American music, literature, visual arts, and theater. The Harlem Renaissance emerged in the context of the Great Migration, when approximately 300,000 African Americans moved from the racially oppressive Jim Crow South to northern urban centers such as Harlem, seeking better opportunities and freedom from segregation. The visual arts were one component of a very rich cultural development, and there was no single style that defined this movement. Rather, artists found different ways to celebrate African American culture and their identity by combining African art with contemporary themes, creating a link that dignified and expanded the history of this community's experience. Jacob Lawrence's Migration series uses bright colors and simplified forms to narrate the mass movement of African Americans from the rural South to the urban North. Through sharp planes of color like the shards of stained glass, he tells the stories that history books ignored. Aaron Douglas, often called the father of African American art, developed a signature style using bold silhouettes, concentric circles, and radiating beams. His murals, like this one, narrate the Black experience from slavery to modern urban life, blending history with visions of progress and hope. Here we see the years between the Emancipation Proclamation and the beginning of the Reconstruction period. Douglas gives us the moment of freedom itself, the Emancipation Proclamation being read aloud, but he doesn't let us stay in that celebration for long. Let's look closer at the figures. Some are ecstatic, their bodies tipped upward, arms flung open in dance. But just beside them on the left, Union soldiers march out of the frame as hooded figures of the Ku Klux Klan enter it. Freedom, Douglas is saying, arrived with its undoing already in tow. The figure at the center points towards a distant city on a hill, presumably the northern cities of the Great Migration. Both Lawrence and Douglas's works are allegories of the resilience, liberation, and cultural affirmation of Black Americans, and they challenge the derogatory caricatures that dominated pop culture by dignifying Black identity and the collective memory through a distinctly modernist visual lexicon. The Great Depression began in 1929 with the stock market crash and set off a period of national crisis. The country was once again searching for identity and meaning, and so came back to the truth of realism, specifically regional realism, social realism, and urban and rural realism. They are often grouped under the umbrella term of American scene painting, and sometimes overlap in subject matter, setting, or intent. First, let's take a look at regionalism. This movement rejected European modernism and urban abstraction in favor of detailed representation and narrative scenes grounded in local traditions and uniquely American sensibilities, especially those of the Midwest and the South. The three leading figures or regionalist triumvirate were Grant Wood from Iowa, Thomas Hart Benton from Missouri, and John Stuart Curry from Kansas. They each drew from their own source of inspiration. Wood was influenced by the Northern Renaissance artist Hans Memling. Benton had been part of the Synchronist movement, and Curry drew from his past career as an illustrator. The best-known work of this movement is one that you've previously seen in its originality or as a reinterpretation, Wood's American Gothic. This painting was awarded a bronze medal at the annual exhibition of American painting held at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1930, and so was immediately disseminated through national newspapers and magazines. The public began to notice, and in doing so, the movement was launched. The pristine clarity and the meticulous precision we see here are the tools of the regionalists. the subjects are real people, Wood's sister and his dentist. Yet here, their identities go beyond that. They are archetypes of Midwestern Americans, a farmer and his daughter standing outside their 1880s white farmer-style home with a Gothic revival window. They stand facing us directly, a position inspired by Flemish Renaissance art which Wood encountered during his travels to Europe. They are at once real and symbolic, representing the stoicism, resilience, and moral fortitude of small-town America. In this seemingly simple composition, Wood remarkably conveys the authenticity and the dignity of ordinary people. Another well-known regionalism piece is Norman Rockwell's Freedom from Want that was created for the Saturday Evening Post magazine. This work was part of his Four Freedoms series, inspired by President Franklin D. Roosevelt's 1941 State of the Union address outlining four fundamental human rights: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. We see a multi-generational family gathered around a table for a holiday meal, with an aproned matriarch presenting a large turkey and the patriarch looking on approvingly from the head of the table. Though Rockwell is most commonly regarded as an illustrator that worked in American realism, he is often associated with regionalism due to his subject matter of choice. In his work, we see an idealized image of everyday American life, and this reflected the nationalist identity that was shaping the United States during the 20th century. He uses sophisticated compositional strategies and a keen sense of storytelling to meld the world of fine art and mass media. Social realism had a more explicitly political agenda. This movement is best understood as a continuation of the earlier tendencies, like the ones we saw from the Ashcan School. Artists such as Jack Levine, Reginald Marsh, Isabel Bishop, William Groper, and Raphael Sawyer turned their attention to the realities of city life people often looked away from, documenting the struggles of the working and lower class, and in doing so, highlighting the failures of governmental and social systems. This movement was shaped by the optimism inspired by the Mexican and Russian revolutions, the devastation of the Great Depression, and the ominous rise of fascism in the 1930s. Jack Levine uses grotesque figuration in works like The Feast of Pure Reason to critique political corruption, further cementing social realism's role as a critical voice in American art. Reginald Marsh's etching, Breadline, No One Has Starved, done at the height of Great Depression, shows a line of men waiting for governmental food handouts, giving us a look at the tangible consequences of the period. In these works, we see the human cost of economic collapse and the decisions made by our governments. And instead of the nostalgic comfort of regionalism, these works confront social problems directly. The geographical movements of urban and rural realism are best understood through the lens of artists like Edward Hopper and Andrew Wyeth, whose works trace the pulse of American anxiety and longing across city streets and open fields. Edward Hopper, more than any other, captured the isolation of the individual within the modern society. His imagery of figures within urban settings go well beyond their role as modern cityscapes to expose the underbelly of the human experience. We can see that in his New York movie painting. In an almost empty theater, a lone usherette leaning on the wall and holding a flashlight is in deep thought. Hopper has bathed her in a dramatic shaft of light that slices through the darkened theater auditorium. The colors are beautiful, rich blues and reds. The stone gray walls and the red seats frame her figure, emphasizing her quiet detachment amid the vast empty public space. So while his oeuvre officially falls within the rubric of urban realism, it offers a far more evocative look at life in the United States between the two world wars. In fact, by stripping away almost any sign of life or movement, and adding dramatic means of representation with striking lighting schemes in claustrophobic spaces, Hopper suggests something of the psychological inner lives of his subjects. And in doing so, he led the way towards the principles of abstract expressionism. Andrew Wyeth, one of America's best-known rural realist painters of the past century, created canvases filled to the brim with the mystery of the real world he was a part of. He rendered landscapes, portraits, and scenes of his everyday life in rural Pennsylvania with exacting detail, working primarily in watercolor and tempera instead of the more typical oil or acrylic. While famous for his astoundingly realist depictions, Wyatt's compositions carry a sense of the uncanny, which led some critics to call him the magic realist. In his painting, That Gentleman, we feel an eerie stillness, an unsettling tension between presence and absence as we look at the subject without his knowledge. Tom Clark was Wyatt's elderly African-American neighbor in Pennsylvania. We see him positioned off-center, occupying the left side of the canvas, while the negative space, an expanse of muted wall, claims the right. A deliberately placed shaft of light catches the back of the chair and Clark's right arm and left hand. The emptiness of the scene, punctuated only by 2 pairs of scissors and a set of keys hung on the wall and a pair of worn-out shoes, is telling. It is a room stripped bare of narrative embellishment. Tom is the only thing that matters, his quiet dignity, his presence filling the room, even with his face turned away. This is one of those works that demands slow looking. At first glance, the scene is subdued, cloaked in darkness and earthly tones, but linger a few moments longer and every brushstroke becomes charged with understated meaning. Although he was beloved by a popular audience and for a time the critical establishment, Wyatt's reputation declined in the 1960s as some felt his paintings did not keep up with the times and were not relevant to a contemporary global culture that was ever-changing. He refused to stop painting what felt so authentically inspirational to him and continued depicting the rural life he had always known.
Now artists say to me, well, why don't you use cameras the way we do now? I mean, the artists go around with cameras and shoot things and then paint them from the studio and from the photograph. I said, I don't do that because the very fact of sitting in a location with an object, the spirit slowly, unconsciously seeps in. I may never look at the drawing again. I may take it home and into the studio and throw it on the floor. That's why a lot of my drawings have my footmarks for them. I may not ever refer to it again. But what I've gotten from the experience of being with the object lifts it beyond photographic realism or just a cold object.
The end of World War II was a time of profound transformation in most countries, including the United States, which rose to become a global superpower with a newfound cultural confidence. Abstract Expressionism, which began in the early 1940s and lasted about 20 years, signaled this new world order by establishing New York as the new epicenter of the Western art world, a role that had previously belonged to Paris. This was the first distinctly American art movement to gain international recognition. It emerged from the convergence of American social realism and regionalism, the influx of European modernist ideas brought by emigrating artists and intellectuals escaping World War II, and the collective trauma and existential instability caused by the war. Abstract Expressionism was not a monolithic style. It is actually divided into 2 principal tendencies: action painting and color field painting. Jackson Pollock, Franz Kline, Lee Krasner, and Willem de Kooning fell into the action painting group, who emphasized the physical act of painting as an essential component of the finished artwork. The process, dripping, splattering, or energetically applying paint, was as important as the finished product. Pollock's piece, Mural on Indian Red Ground, measuring at 2.4 by 1.8 meters, is a large-scale painting he completed by laying the canvas on the floor and moving around it to drip and smear paint across its surface. We see a vivid dark red background covered with primarily black, white, and yellow paint that can't help but scream the word spontaneity. This technique was a radical departure from traditional easel painting and challenged fundamental assumptions about how art should be made. Color field artists like Clifford Still Mark Rothko, and Barnett Newman created planned compositions where the psychological and spiritual effect of color itself was the intent. Still's works showcase bold colors in jagged forms. Rothko turned towards delicate rectangles of color, and Newman created zip paintings, where vertical strips of color intersected large horizontal fields. Then there is Helen Frankenthaler. She was most closely associated with color field painting, yet also held close the ethos of action painters and their emphasis on the process. She came up with a new technique of applying art. Soak staining, which we can see in Mountains and Sea, is a method of painting where she would pour thin paint onto unprimed canvas and would give it time to soak and spread organically. The final product is a luminous flowing field of color. As a whole, abstract expressionists were united by the belief that art should convey deep emotion, psychological states, and universal themes through abstraction rather than representation. Peggy Guggenheim's exhibition at her Art of This Century gallery supported the emerging movement. It was innovative in both its design and its curatorial approach, as you can see here, and gave young artists such as Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, and Clifford Still unprecedented exposure and opportunities to develop their work. At the same time, influential art critics like Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg were essential in shaping the public and intellectual understanding of abstract expressionism. They spoke on the theoretical frameworks that explained and justified the movement's new approaches, helping to give it legitimacy and international prominence. Beginning in 1952, the Neo-Dada movement developed as a response to the dominance of abstract expressionism. These artists drew inspiration from the earlier Dada movement of the 1910s and 1920s, which rejected conventional aesthetics and embraced absurdity. However, while Dada was anti-art and anti-meaning, Neo-Dada artists believed in personal meaning and worked within the art world to expand its boundaries. They rejected the emotionally charged abstract expressionists before them, and instead adopted a more ironic, playful, and sometimes critical approach, both mocking and celebrating popular culture. They incorporated non-traditional materials and found objects, such as newspapers, fabric, and household items into their work. Robert Rauschenberg is known for his combines, which merged painting and sculpture using found objects. In his piece, Bed, we see a pillow, a sheet, and a quilt mounted vertically on a wall. It is painted with expressive strokes of paint here and pencils here. By using real bedding as both the canvas and subject, a choice that the artist made because he didn't have a canvas to paint on, Rauschenberg collapsed the boundary between art and everyday life, embodying the core Neo-Dada idea that art could be made from anything and could exist anywhere. Jasper Johns is another notable artist of the movement. You might know his familiar series of flag paintings. He used this subject matter to question the meaning and status of everyday imagery as art. This movement was the bridge between abstract expressionism and later movements such as pop art, minimalism, and conceptual art. Pop art was an international movement that had begun in Great Britain in 1952, led by the Independent Group, which included artists such as Richard Hamilton, Nigel Henderson, John McHale, Sir Eduardo Palozzi, and William Turnbull. It was fueled by American pop culture viewed from a distance. The American version, however, began to take form in the early 1960s and was inspired by what American artists saw and experienced living within that culture. At the same time, the US was becoming more and more consumer-oriented. Young artists felt that what they were taught in art school and what they saw in museums did not have anything to do with their lives or the things they saw around them every day. So they turned to Hollywood movies, advertising, product packaging, and comic books for inspiration. This subject matter in fine art was a novel one, and one that took into consideration commercial aesthetics. Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, and James Rosenquist used images taken from mass media and pop culture to challenge the hierarchies between high and low culture. They believed that these subjects were as worthy of artistic attention as traditional themes from mythology, religion, or nature. Unsurprisingly, critics were not immediately on board and viewed it as a joke or fad rather than a serious movement. Warhol's Campbell's soup cans consist of 32 canvases, each depicting a different variety of Campbell's soup. The repetition and uniformity here reflect the influence of mass production and the ubiquity of branded goods in post-war America. The movement also introduced commercial techniques like screen printing and used materials associated with mass production. It's important to note that while pop artists celebrated consumer culture, they also critiqued it, using irony and satire to question the values of celebrity worship and the commodification of everyday life. As Lichtenstein has said, pop art looks out into the world. It doesn't look like a painting of something. It looks like the thing itself. In New York in the early 1960s, minimalist artists such as Agnes Martin, Dan Flavin, Robert Morris, and Frank Stella created works from industrial materials. This movement once again redefined what constituted as art, but this time through reduction or restraint. Minimalist artists often rejected traditional art-making methods and materials, opting instead for industrial materials and techniques as a way to remove any visible trace of their artistic hand. These artworks, composed of simple geometric shapes with clean lines and hard edges, lack brushwork, bold colors, narrative, or any emotional content. The object's presence and the viewer's direct experience are the only things that matter. They embrace the idea that what you see is what you see, meaning the artwork is simply itself, nothing more, nothing less. The one element that is integral to minimalist pieces is the placement, scale, and environment in which it's exhibited. We are asked to experience the work in relation to the surrounding space. Influenced by minimalism's reductive simplicity came conceptual art. Beginning in the 1960s, this movement asserted that the underlying idea or concept of a piece of art was paramount, more important than the artist's technical skills, the visual aesthetics, or even the materials themselves. In fact, the execution of creating is often a secondary priority. Solowitz's paragraphs on conceptual art became the de facto manifesto of the movement, and there he wrote, "No matter what form it may finally have, it must begin with an idea." And so conceptual artists used whatever materials best suited their ideas, including text, documentation, photography, installations, everyday objects, and even instructions. Lowitz's wall drawings are a great example of this movement. 1,350 wall drawings from the late 1960s until 2007, executed not by the artist himself, but by others following his written instructions. The physical realization could be carried out by anyone, anywhere, at any time. The artist's hand or even presence was no longer necessary, redirecting the focus back to the idea or concept itself. The 1970s marked the beginning of what we call contemporary art. This movement doesn't fit into a neat little box like many of the ones that preceded it. It's diverse in mediums, techniques, materials, subject matter, and even ideologies, and often speaks on social and political matters. Out of the civil rights and the women's liberation movements came a subset of contemporary art, the Feminist Art movement.
Women artists have never gotten the serious attention and certainly not the serious money that male artists do.
Artists, many of whom were women, began making work that addressed gender inequality, identity, and the representation of women in society. They wanted to rewrite a falsely male-dominated art history, change the contemporary world around them through their art, intervene in the established art world, and challenge the existing art canon. The formation of women's art organizations, such as the Art Workers Coalition and Women Artists in Revolution, was critical in this regard. These groups advocated for equal representation in museums and galleries, organized protests, and established alternative spaces and publications to support women artists. Institutional initiatives were equally significant. Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro founded the California Institute of the Arts Woman House, a performance and exhibition space centered upon female empowerment. Here, women artists collaborated and created major installations that explored women's roles in society. Chicago's The Dinner Party is an iconic work within the movement. This large-scale installation consists of elaborate place settings on a triangular table for 39 mythical and historical guests, celebrating the women that came before, fought, and achieved great success despite the limitations placed upon them. Other artists, such as Faith Ringgold, used media traditionally associated with women's work, quilting, and storytelling to highlight the experiences of Black women.
Many of us would commit our art to the experience of being Black in America. Then the issue came, well, why are you doing that? You had to justify your existence, your culture.
The influence of feminist art extended far beyond its immediate context. It actively supported and inspired the development of queer art, which addressed issues of queer identity and responded to the gay pride movement and the AIDS crisis. It also ushered in an era of identity art and identity politics, foregrounding the experiences of marginalized groups and exposing the systemic inequities they faced. In 1970s Germany, an artist by the name of Georg Baselitz led a revival of the Expressionist movement of the early 1900s. Expressionism was a response to the anxiety around humanity's increasingly discordant relationship with the world and accompanying lost feelings of authenticity and spirituality. By the 1980s, the resurgence of Expressionism, or Neo-Expressionism, found its way to the United States. This movement distanced itself from the emotional detachment of Minimalism and Conceptual Art, and instead turned towards the reintroduction of emotion, narration, and figurative elements. These works are often quite large in size, shocking at first glance, and are filled with vivid colors. They draw from the artist's subjective experience, yes, but also look to mythological, cultural, historical, nationalist, and sometimes erotic subject matter. Artists like Jean-Michel Basquiat and Leon Golub depicted their subjects in an almost raw and brutish manner, using highly textural and expressive brushwork and intense colors that have been rejected by the immediately preceding art movements. Basquiat's untitled Skull is a large-scale painting measuring at approximately 1.8 by 1.7 meters. It features a skull-like visage painted in gestural strokes using acrylic, oil stick, and spray paint. The background is layered with graffiti-like marks, illegible text, and symbols, such as the recurring three-pronged crown that references Basquiat's engagement with African-American identity, power structures, and his own mortality. The artist, however, has wiped out the hieroglyphs and the crown, leaving us with only hints of meaning rather than a proclamation. The skull, with its bold, vibrant colors and chaotic lines, dominates the canvas in a manner that conveys both rawness and a sense of urgency. Basquiat had the ability to evoke a feeling of anguish and existential anxiety, channeling the complexities and tensions of urban life, particularly as experienced by marginalized communities in contemporary America. America's artistic timeline is less a parade of masterpieces and more a record of what Americans have found worth seeing, and sometimes how they wanted to be seen. It's a story of feelings, ambitions, accidents, and the occasional stroke of genius. The art of a time is its emotional weather report, and by tracing this progression, we see how artists responded to and shaped the American experience. Today, the American art scene continues this tradition of transformation, incorporating digital technologies, global cultural influences, and expanded definitions of artistic practice while building upon the foundational achievements of previous generations.